Welcome everyone to this sixth webinar presented by the University of the West Indies School of Education, St. Augustine Campus in Trinidad. A special welcome to our colleagues from our sister campuses and our overseas participants, and to all of you from the education sector, whether first time or repeat guests at our webinar series. We also welcome all retired educators and decision makers in education, as well as all practicing educators and those non-educators who have an interest in education. I am Jennifer Yaminali, Senior Lecturer at the School of Education and former Director there. I will moderate today's webinar, taking us all through the various segments. Today's webinar, as you no doubt know, is entitled In Pursuit of Radical Educational Reform for Trinidad and Tobago, and features presentations from 4 esteemed and learned colleagues in the field of education and educational leadership. We will also cater for your participation by inviting questions at the relevant points on the program. To place this webinar in context, we are reminded of our Honorable Prime Minister's 2020 promise of radical or transformational reform for the education system of Trinidad and Tobago. He later indicated that education policy promised and fulfilled in the past had greatly impacted his own life. In 2018, Dr. William Warren Smith, head of the CBD, signaled the urgent need for an education strategy focused on training and retraining of the labor force to meet new job market requirements. He was of the view that we need to radically change our education system. He said we must change what, how, and when people learn. Against that background, the webinar will now commence with a welcome from Dr. Heather Cato, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, and also a Senior Lecturer in Caribbean History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus. Her research focus has led to a revisionary approach to plantation and enslavement systems in the Caribbean. Her publications include Turning Tides, Beyond the Tradition, Reinterpreting the Caribbean Historical Experience, The Caribbean in the Atlantic World and Capitalism and Slavery 50 Years Later. She is co-editor of the book, Beyond the Tradition, Reinterpreting the Caribbean Historical Experience. Dr. Cato has been a relentless champion of the work of the School of Education over the years. I now hand over to her. Dr. Cato.
Thank you, Jennifer. I must admit from the onset that it feels very good to be with a group of people whose goal it is to facilitate radical, transformative change in our education system. I will also confess that I hope to be a very effective part of this process, and so we can understand that I am all in with this one. I am inspired in terms of how I'm approaching this theme for today by Times Magazine's concept of the overdue awakening that they have developed in relation to this pandemic. I have therefore adapted the hashtag, "It's not a restart, it's a rethink." This hashtag must be applied to our education system. This is the 6th webinar in a series that has been put on by the School of Education over the last year. You all would know who usually join us that I tend to congratulate the unit at the end, but I am going to do it from the start. Congratulations, School of Education. I have been fortunate to be a part of each of these webinars, and I feel today really represents the culmination of what we set out to do. We started with a simple question: how do you educate the whole child in a pandemic? We then moved on to the challenges, such as critical examinations when you're only 11 plus. We grappled with gender. We tackled STEM, STEAM, and STREAM. We explored the need for evidence-based policy, and we have arrived today at what I think is our ultimate destination: radical education transformation. I believe that my positions on these issues have matured through these discussions that we've had. In every seminar, the level and the nature of the participation has cemented the need for interventions like this at this time. I am convinced that this is where we've been headed for the last 10 years without even realizing it. I am preparing to grapple with you all on this issue of radical education reform. It was difficult for me to verbalize what it really meant. Is it special education? Is it designed to create equity? Is it about participating actively and in different ways? Is it about connecting education more directly to workforce needs? Is it simply about critiquing traditional education approaches and making it better? It very well might be all of the above and more. I have come to the conclusion that it will mean different things to different people and to even different communities and countries. I believe, therefore, that it is up to us to delineate what radical education reform will mean for Trinidad and Tobago in 2021. We must create our own blueprint tailored to our specific needs. And therein, colleagues, therein lies the complexity of what we are trying to illuminate today. Thus, we must use our peculiar Trinidad and Tobago context to engage, reassess, reevaluate the content, the role, the place of education in our development trajectory. I sense that most of us now have an urgent feeling that change must come. However, I think it is also true that for most of us, the precise nature of that change is still ambiguous. At times, it seems all-encompassing. Jennifer talked about when, how, what, why, and how we learn. With such a broad and heavy mandate, it is no surprise that it is often difficult to embrace the uncomfortableness that must come if we are to truly experience the kind of transformation needed. We must remember that our current system is anchored with strong roots, and some of those roots go back centuries. Changing our processes, structures, and ultimately our cultures is no easy task. So colleagues, buckle up. It's going to be rough. This, I think, makes today's discussion of a rethink critical and timely. We have to rethink not only what we do as parents, guardians, educators, administrators. We must rethink how we do it. How do we move forward from today? I also want to submit for your consideration that part of the problem is that too much of our considerations is done in an atmosphere of contestation. Contestation is usually a catalyst for change, and this is good. But we must evolve into another kind of space so that our society as a whole really benefits. Different fora are needed to facilitate and cement transformation. I really hope that this will be one of those fora. Why is the case of Trinidad and Tobago so complex? One of the reasons is that numerous narratives intersect here. We have a history characterized by cruelty, violence, racism, colonization. We have people with amazing determination, creativity, and survival instinct. We have enduring legacies of empire, dependency, marginalization in this international system. We have a people characterized by hybridity, blending of cultures. We have the conundrum of diaspora versus national identity. And we have several waves of immigration and the related complexities. We're complex, but I believe in that complexity lies our strengths. In spite of the challenges, we have done extremely well, and I think we should never underplay that. However, as we move swiftly towards the middle of the 21st century, we can do better and we must do better. How do we shape a qualitatively different future? I suggest we start with the now. We must fully appreciate the nature of the historical watershed that we are smack in the middle of. We must understand how we've gotten to this point. I believe we are in a transition phase. As a people, just think about it. We have experienced indigenous genocide, the atrocities of indentureship and enslavement, the challenges of forging new nations, the ravages of environmental crises, hurricanes, diseases, pandemics. We looked for solutions. We looked to emancipation. We looked to decolonization. We looked to independence. All of these were supposed to create new pathways. These developments brought significant changes, but dangerous continuities persist. We are realizing in 2021 that decolonization must enter another phase. We are realizing that we need a new development trajectory. We are realizing that we need new engines of growth. A necessary corollary to these pathways is our education system, and therefore it must be retaught. As we prepare to enter the next stage of Caribbean nationhood, which I think is being ushered in, 4 headlights must guide us: our history, our education philosophy, our data-driven policies grounded in local and regional research, and a new education agenda and framework. This pandemic at its core is really about who we are today and who we want to be tomorrow. It has unleashed social and cultural movements that we must reckon with. It has altered economic projections. The inequity that we learn to live with can no longer be ignored. We have new lenses tattooed on all our eyes, and these new lenses will be central to shaping the future. To put it simply, we've had a shakeup in 2020 and 21. And this shakeup has brought to the forefront the issues that we must grapple with in the 21st century. Just imagine our small communities are well on its way to beating a pandemic. However, we have proven to be resilient to decolonization. And I include in this the current inequity with respect to the distribution of the vaccine. Learn the lesson. We can beat a pandemic, but we can't shake the legacies of our history. How do we make it different the second time around? This is where radical education reform comes in. The next stage of our development must involve the evolution of an education system which will be the vehicle for the changes we need. To be impactful, we must lead the way and grapple with the issues on the education front. Our roles extend beyond the number of students who pass examinations and the number of scholarships a school gets. It's about the kind of people and society that we are creating. It is about preparing the next generation for a future that will be very different. It is about preparing for the next phase of Caribbean development, which must be better than the last. It is about making sure that this time we take the people as a whole with us and not a segment of the population. I always pause and imagine what would happen if we find a way to unleash the potential in all of us. And finally, it is also about moving from the periphery and heading to the center of the international stage. In a nutshell, this is my vision as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education about what radical education reform is all about. I am now going to leave the difficult part to you all. I look forward to the interviews, the presentations, the questions, the answers. Welcome, all of you. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Cato. You understand so well the peculiarities of our situation. We take note of the need for awakening, and like you, we too are grappling with the concept of radical educational reform and its ambiguity and its complexity. Who are we today, you ask, and who will we be tomorrow? Perhaps we may not have the answers today, but let's move on and see what we can get out of our webinar today. Where will we land? Moving on now, the Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the St. Augustine Campus of the University of the West Indies has himself been a keen supporter of the work of the School of Education. Having been campus principal since July 2016, Professor Copeland has won many prestigious awards. In 2008, he was the first recipient of the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and in 2007, he was a joint recipient of the Shikonia Medal Gold as a member of the GPAN development team. Among other awards, he also received the Guardian Life Premium Teaching Award in 2002, the BP Amoko Fellowship Award for Senior Academic Staff in 2001, and the Lapser Fulbright Scholarship for the doctoral program at the University of Southern California in 1987, way back in his history. His efforts to chart the UWI on a growth path have been unflinching. His agenda for the St. Augustine campus is focused on education for survival, systems for the sustainability of life at a decent and acceptable level, and the inculcation of a culture of innovation. The ideal aim is a culture that seamlessly allows the creation of a brand new knowledge, ideas, or inventions with market potential. As campus principal, he is committed to realizing the goal of creating an innovative and entrepreneurial university, a vital partner to industry and governments in Caribbean development. For him, St. Augustine can and will be a major catalyst in economic diversification through our teaching and outreach programs. I now invite Professor Copeland to make his contribution to today's webinar. Professor Copeland.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that very complimentary introduction. And good afternoon to all my colleagues, the presenters this afternoon, Mr. Harrilal Seecharan, Professor Delisle, Dr. Freddie James, and thank you, Heather, for that wonderful sort of rendition you did not too long ago. To all staff and students who are viewing here, other viewing audience, and members of the media. First, let me thank the School of Education in mounting a seminar on this topic, one that addresses, I do believe, the overhaul or the rethink, as Heather defined it, of our national education system to support educational growth and development. A hearty congratulations. Some time ago, the Ministry of Education of Trinidad and Tobago produced a draft education policy. That paper was 2017 to 2022. The purpose of that policy paper was to guide its actions through the next 5 years, that's a quote from it, and also to treat with current challenges within the education system. The primary goal being sustainable national development. At that time, I responded to the call for comment on this new draft education policy and made two comments that I consider key to any discourse. Firstly, there is a need to establish a clear, practical, meaningful, and applicable rationale for a national education system. As the previous speaker pointed out, this system was, well, I'm sort of paraphrasing what she said. It was designed for somebody else. It's time for us to take full control of our reins to guide our destiny. I opined then, and I've continued to express on public platforms, that this could be effectively and simply stated in the following way. It goes like this. The national education agenda must seek to equip citizens with those skills that will enable them to survive and thrive in societal scenarios that range from the catastrophic to the ideal, however defined, even as they play their roles in sustaining and growing the society. It's a much longer definition elsewhere, but we don't have time for that. We have done relatively well in meeting the challenge of growing and sustaining society, although there's much room for improvement, hence the meeting today. However, by and large, we have neglected to adequately prepare our citizens for the bad times. Regrettably, almost as if to prove this point, there came the unprecedented global pandemic by the name of COVID-19. Now, if there are citizens who have gone through our education system up to secondary or post-secondary level and are struggling mentally and physically in this environment, then I submit that our system has failed them. Secondly, I also express the view that any education policy, and I'm quoting here from the response I gave, it should factor in the non-formal as well as the informal components of education. It must be holistic. This recognition of the non-formal and the informal will then support an inclusive, holistic education of all citizens, enabling us to achieve that survive and thrive rationale that I expressed above. And this requires our Ministry of Education to set objectives and guidelines for those sectors, in fact, for all the sectors, formal, as we have now, non-formal, and informal. Now, there's precedent for such an approach in other parts of the world. In Indonesia, for example, enshrined in law, I believe, going back all the way to 1940, is the framework for an educational system that is structured in streams consisting of those three components: formal, non-formal, and informal. I want to quote here from the TIMS website, and I'm quoting here: "These streams can complement and enrich each other through face-to-face classroom interactions, which may be supplemented or replaced with distance learning at higher levels of education." And it goes on to say, all streams, levels, and types of education are educational units organized by the national government, local governments, the community, or any combination thereof. It's a national agenda. Formal education, as you know, and I know I'm preaching to the converted and to the experts, but forgive me. Formal education consists of the usual three levels: primary or basic, as some people call it, secondary and higher education, providing general, vocational, professional, vocational, technical, religious, and special education. Indonesia has a strong sort of bias to the religious component. And if you check the website, you'll see exactly what I mean. Non-formal education aims to develop student potential with an emphasis on acquiring knowledge and functional skills, as well as honing personal and professional attitudes, and is provided to replace, complement, or supplement formal education in support of lifelong learning. Now, interestingly, this includes as well homeschooling. I am most impressed by the facilitation of informal learning, which, upon successful completion of the assessments against national education standards, is recognized as equivalent to formal or non-formal education. Further, there's no doubt that our informal sector is, as Professor Delisle has indicated to me, it's quite strong, even dominant. I'm quoting from him here. In some areas, such as environmental education, music education and training, as well as special and inclusive needs. But we simply need to start the process of consolidating the multiplicity of efforts across the nation. As our response to the challenges of the pandemic has shown, rapid innovations in technology continue to open up new possibilities for leapfrogging our agendas in education as much as it has in the business sector. We cannot get a proper handle on national education system outcomes unless we factor in all the means through which our citizens are educated, Bringing the informal and non-formal sectors more fully into a new policy on education in Trinidad and Tobago is therefore both a critical and a necessary step. Now, there's one other comment I wish to add before I close, and this has to do with how a Ministry of Education can enhance its monitoring and response strategies for the performance of educational units which are under its remit. The key intent here is to apply appropriate measurements at the exit and entry points so as to determine the educational gains imparted to students upon completion of their course of study. I stress that this measurement is not on academic performance, but on skill levels independent of disciplinary content and curricula. Examples include the Graduate Skills Assessment, or GSA, in Australia, and the Collegiate Learning Assessment in the US. Both were designed for undergraduate programs and have asked for consideration of an adaptation for inclusion in our teaching and learning enterprise at UWI. However, I'm proposing here that similar tools should be devised to conduct the assessment of educational gains at ECCE all the way through to secondary and tertiary levels. There may be different tools required at different phases. The beauty of that is that the Ministry of Education is investing in education to determine whether any particular unit is performing to standard or not. And this is beyond, as I said, academic performance. So ladies and gentlemen, many years ago, CARICOM identified that an educated workforce is crucial to the development of this region in an era where a vibrant knowledge economy still remains the success indicator for countries worldwide. At that time, as it is today, science, technology, and innovation were accepted as solid in the underpinnings of any education and key to successful and competitive economies. But here we are in 2021. 1 year away from when that draft policy, to which I referred at the start of these brief remarks, would have expired. Generally speaking, we are all in agreement that the methodologies used a century ago are likely to have the desired student learning outcomes required for 21st century citizenry and workforce. But we are stymied in our response to this challenge. So while I'm happy to be part of the seminar, I feel as if I've been here before. I'm therefore very much looking forward, not just to this afternoon's symposium, with a diverse stakeholder representation, as well as a post-event continuation of the discussions on the matters that will be raised here. Beyond that, I'm anxiously awaiting the fulsome consideration and implementation of so many well-researched and previously documented recommendations. We in Trinidad and Tobago cannot wait much longer for radical educational reform. Through our own dalliance and our propensity to talk issues to death, we have reached the change or die phase of radical reform. We need real, not cosmetic change, one that requires a change in mindsets because the old ones simply no longer work. So if we do not change, well, I think I'll end right there. We understand where this is going to go. I'd like to thank you for having me this evening, and I wish everyone a very, very successful event. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Campus Principal. Your spin on education is clearly focused and has always been clearly focused on how we as human beings are preparing ourselves to survive and thrive in a complex world. And you're concerned that currently we might not be providing for that survival. A need to establish a clear rationale for an education system suited to us as a people is noted as a point you would like to underline. We also acknowledge your suggestions for formal, non-formal, and informal streams to cater for all. Monitoring of performance is also a welcome idea for us as educators. Science, technology, and innovation, we will also remember as your keywords. We welcome your company on the uphill struggle ahead, and we will try our very best not to talk this webinar to death. Professor Copeland, we wish you well in the months ahead in these trying times. So attendees, let me now just orient you to how the rest of the webinar is structured. First, we will move into a recorded segment where Ms. Keisha Nichols interviews Mr. Harrilal Seecharan, former CEO of the Ministry of Education of Trinidad and Tobago. After that interview, you will have the opportunity to pose questions or make contributions regarding Mr. Seecharan's interview. Following that segment, there will be a lead presentation and 3 responses, which I will introduce individually. Our interviewer, Ms. Keisha Nichols, holds a bachelor's degree in literatures and English with linguistics and a diploma in education in the teaching of English, both from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. She is currently enrolled in the Masters in Education Leadership program at this university. She has over 15 years teaching experience and at present holds the position of acting vice principal at her school. She is an advocate for equity in education and has always had a desire to help students to develop into whole, integrated young citizens who can contribute positively to their communities and their country. Miss Nicole, interviews Mr. Seecharan. Mr. Seecharan has spent many years as the CEO in the Ministry of Education, and he has had a lifetime, I would say, of decision-making in hard times and not so good times. He has been the beneficiary of experience in many phases of his life. So we're going to hear from him now, as the focus of the interview is his life in pursuit of education reform.
Pleasant evening to our esteemed panel of presenters, specially invited guest, Mr. Harrilal Seecharan, and the wider viewing audience. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Keisha Nichols, and I have the privilege this evening of sharing this virtual stage with such great minds. I feel especially honored to have been given the opportunity to interview Mr. Harrilal Seecharan, who would have served as Chief Education Officer in the Ministry of Education of Trinidad and Tobago up until March 2020. Mr. Seecharan, during his tenure as Chief Education Officer, would have managed several divisions in the Ministry of Education. Given the fact that he has served as a pioneer and navigator in education for very many years, I am confident that this evening's conversation will be insightful and provide great leads into radical reform in education for our Twin Isle nation. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Mr. Seecharan.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Seecharan, can you begin this evening by telling us a bit about the roles and responsibilities of the Chief Education Officer in the Ministry of Education?
I think the Chief Education Officer plays a critical role in terms of providing technical advice to the Ministry of Education throughout the education system. In addition to that, the Chief Education Officer has responsibility for a number of units and divisions within the ministry in areas such as curriculum, management and supervision of schools, examination, testing, research, so that it centers around providing technical support on the one hand, but also through units and division, ensuring that initiatives are rolled out.
And as you mentioned initiatives, I'd like to turn our attention to school-based management. And I would want you to tell us a bit about how the installation of local school boards and other similar initiatives would have helped with improving parental relationships as well as partnerships with communities in preparing us for facing difficulties as we are now facing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
The local school boards were set up recognizing the importance of school-based management and more specifically the role of parents and the community in the operation of schools. The constitution of the school board, comprising of community representatives, representation from the PTA, alumni, the student body, the principals, I think the composition is ideal for fostering that community and stakeholder engagement. The school board serves as one to not just expand community involvement, but provide support for the operation of schools through either supporting initiatives at the level of the school, or in fact coming up with initiatives, including areas such as infrastructure, et cetera, where you know we have a lot of challenges. Yes. I can tell you that there are many schools through the local school board and of course engagement of parents who would have provide additional support for the schools in terms of reach out to parents during the COVID process. There are local school boards which would have provided devices through their own initiative, so that while the success across the entire system might be varied. I think it's a system which can, in fact, certainly enhance support when issues such as COVID and other issues arise in the school system.
Excellent. And you talked about the impact of the local school board. Can you tell me a bit about the community and how strengthening those community partnerships may be able to help us survive the effects of COVID-19?
I think particularly now where we have moved to a virtual environment,
Yes.
getting parents involved is critical. I think having supervision of students and understanding the new requirements for students and what is being done on the side of the school. As I said again, there are many schools through which that communication, the PTA has taken a leading role in communicating with parents and ensuring students are online. Not a perfect system yet, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Most certainly. And can you tell me a bit about research and the role research and data collection might have played during your tenure as Chief Education Officer in terms of decision making and policy implementation?
I think for me, data and research are critical elements in terms of implementation of any initiative.
Yes.
I certainly would have ensured that in whatever area that I was looking at implementing anything, treating with data in terms of making decisions, certainly also the area of research. We have attempted in the ministry to strengthen the research capacity and also outreach with, for example, tertiary organizations. To tell you that we are where we should be, I don't think we are quite there yet. We've had challenges with capacity in terms of personnel and the retention of that personnel within the ministry. In terms of data, we've made significant progress through our school-based management framework and use of data in terms of implementing initiatives at the level of the school, understanding the context and the culture of schools. I think we still need to move now from looking data at one level to going in further and making that deep dive to focusing and targeting some of the interventions to the specific problems. But I think it's a work in progress and there's still quite a bit of work to be done.
As you mentioned, looking at research and data in specific areas, if you were still Chief Education Officer, is there any particular area that you would like to focus your research or data collection at this point?
Well, I think one of the things we've spoken and tried, we've made a few attempts to get education management information system. Right. Personally, I would have had challenges in terms of moving data from schools and bringing that together in terms of informing decision making. So certainly having a system which transcends all levels would help in that process, so the data collection becomes much easier. There are a number of areas. I think during my tenure, one of the things that I tried to do is to move towards focusing more on the quality aspect of education, so that moving research to the level of the school, I think we have national level indicators in terms of issues relating to literacy and numeracy, leadership and governance in schools and all of that. I think moving now to the level of the schools where you actually implement some of those initiatives, targeting schools and specific schools would certainly help.
Excellent. And as you spoke about targeting specific schools, I would like to take it to that idea of culture. And we know that culture is critical to school enrichment and student achievement. So can you tell me about some of the initiatives that might have been taken by you and your team to improve the culture of some of the lower performing secondary schools in our country?
Okay, well, let me first of all say that I think a number of the past initiatives within the ministry tended to focus on those structural elements of the initiative, in other words, how to get it done. and less so on the culture aspect in terms of the why. In other words, getting buy-in. We would have had and would have looked at issues relating to change management when we were rolling out initiatives. However, I think what we have done, and certainly some of the initiatives that I would have overseen, we've tried to build in that. So if I can talk a little bit, for example, about the school-based management initiative that we've redesigned and refocused to take our context, which is based on the effective school research and really targets those areas. It looks at, so for example, changing culture in school requires clear leadership at the level of the school, so that our model caters for that leadership and governance and that tone at the top. It takes into consideration an understanding of students, and therefore students is at the center of our model. Effective schools treat with teacher professional development, testing and assessment, pedagogy, teacher training. So those are the lenses which we have incorporated into the model. And therefore, in terms of the school-based management model and moving to school development planning, those are the lenses that we are using, but using an understanding of the school and the context and those barriers that might impact on implementation, so that we've moved to another level. As I said, I think what we have is schools now using data, however, taking it to that next level with a deep dive. So an issue relating to, let's say, literacy and numeracy may not necessarily be a pedagogy issue, but it might be a student attendance issue. So that understanding the context and the culture of schools, how we do things, how schools are organized, those beliefs, practices, rituals that really make schools what they are, I think is critical.
Thank you so much. And as we speak about change and making our schools more effective, we know that one of the things that we must consider always is the political landscape. And in your experience, can you tell me whether the political climate or any other social conflicts existing at the time might have impeded any of the policies that might have been implemented?
I wouldn't call it a conflict, but we've had many very heated discussions at the level of the ministry. Not of a political nature, but often when, for example, research and what is required is not aligned to whether it's a political view or finance requirements or resources, those create challenges. I think more important than that, though, is also what I call the political cycle, the policy cycle, where every 4 to 5 years we tend to forget what we've done in the past rather than looking at sustainability of some of those initiatives, and we restart the process. And I think that has been significant in terms of impacting on some of the initiatives that we've had over the years.
Thank you so much for your openness and honesty with regards to that topic. And in your previous response, you would have mentioned some critical stakeholders being our teachers. Can you tell us a bit about some of the initiatives, the professional development initiatives that might have been taken by you and your team to help improve teacher quality in Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah, teacher quality is, again, one of the critical elements of moving any education system forward. I think that teacher-student interaction is at the core of what our business. So that teacher training is important. At the ministry, we have worked with the tertiary level institution in terms of external training to expand, for example, it depends on some of the other training initiatives at the primary school level. In-house, we've also looked at some of the critical areas, for example, the induction program for beginning teachers, which we've moved to over a 2-year period in-house. And that is one, I think, that is very important for us. ICT in education. We've developed an ICT policy, we have an ICT plan, and in terms of rolling that out, we have actually trained maybe 75% of teachers at the secondary level, at least in terms of utilization of ICT in lesson planning and in that process. we have also looked at the issue of literacy and numeracy and training in those areas. And of course, we've done training on school-based management for principals. Now, let me just tell you that often in looking from the outside at the ministry, a lot of things appear to be clear-cut and easy to do. We've done those training without any funding. So that it really requires a lot of creativity in terms of getting venues, getting persons to do the training with the requisite competencies. Yeah. We've actually also moved to a blended learning approach in the ministry so that we can actually do more training with more persons. So that teacher professional development is critical. We've made some progress in that area. Certainly additional funding will help, but it's something that needs to be ongoing.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. Given the economic stringency that the ministry experiences, do you think it's possible to sustain professional development initiatives such as those you mentioned previously?
I think you don't have an option. Because if your core business is teaching and learning, upskilling your teachers, I think is one of the first areas you need to look at. And maybe there's a case to be made for relooking at how we prioritize funding in education. Because some of the areas that really touch on the quality elements are some of the areas that are least funded. Right. And you spoke earlier about conflicts, and that's one of the challenges that we've had in terms of moving the process forward. I believe the difficulty with funding creates an opportunity to improve the efficiency of how we've done business. Right. As I said, we have been able to do training for significant number of teachers in-house, and not one-day training. I'm talking about training over a period of time, using internal resources, identifying personnel who would bring value to the table. Right. And therefore, I think it is possible to continue the process. Certainly some funding or additional funding will help in terms of moving that process forward.
And while we talk about the issue of funding, we know that one of the major issues the COVID-19 pandemic would have exposed is that of equity in education. Therefore, if you were still Chief Education Officer, what areas would you now focus on to alleviate that issue of equity in education?
Well, let me just step back a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think the issue of equity has been talked about a lot.
Yes.
We have actually used data in the ministry, and people may not be aware, in terms of targeting schools. So for example, we've used national test data and SCA data in terms of identifying those schools that are in most need of support, yes, and have actually focused more resources in terms of personnel. So the literacy and numeracy persons from curriculum would have been visiting certain schools. So we have actually, in a sense, already started that process of targeting resources where it is most needed. And I think, so that's one step in the direction. I think COVID has brought in another dimension to education. Now, as I indicated earlier, we actually have an ICT policy, we have an ICT plan. Yes. The absence of resources limited how far we could have gone with that. And I think it is important, and I rethink needs to be done in terms of how we incorporate ICT. I don't think we can go back to pre-COVID and that model. I think the present COVID crisis has highlighted, I think, the social inequities within the system, and therefore to bring everybody to the table and provide that equality of opportunities for all. I think ICT is one of the areas that we have to bring to the fore and address in a systemic way.
Yes. And given the fact that we are talking about change and improvement in a radical way in education, do you think it's important that we empower our leaders in such a way that we create technocrats that will drive that sort of change that we envision?
My personal experience is that we've had challenges in terms of capacity, both in terms of personnel and filling of vacancies. Yes. So we've had units where you ended up with bare bones numbers, but also in terms of capacity of many of our heads and leaders within the ministry to manage the manage initiatives and change within the system. So I think that is an area that I certainly would look at targeting. There's still need for a lot of development. And it's not about any one person or any fault of anybody. I think the way the system evolves, where people are promoted throughout the system without really preparing them to move to the next level. And that is something that we need to look at. For example, at the level of the schools and at the level of leadership. I think there is a need. We've been trying to fill some of that gap through the school-based management model and the training there. But I think that has to now be built in because we recognize the importance of that. And those schools who have embraced those elements of school-based management have in fact shown improvement. And you would be aware of a number of schools where they're always in the media for the wrong reason and they're now out of the media. So we've made progress in many of those schools. And therefore that aspect I think is critical.
Mr. Seecharan, I make reference to some of the leading reformers in education, such as Finland, Korea, Singapore, who have made great leads by way of radical reform in education. Have we taken example from any of these leading reformers in implementing any of our policies, or have we allowed it to contribute to our decision-making in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I can tell you certainly while I was sitting in the chair, we would have looked at research across the board. There are persons who expect us to take things from countries like Finland, South Korea, etc. And I just want to caution that you mentioned the issue of culture and context earlier on, and therefore transplanting initiatives from other jurisdictions to Trinidad and Tobago has to be done taking on board our own context. And therefore we've done that. We've always factored in three things. One is research, one is best practice, and the third area is our own local context. You would appreciate, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago being a multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic country with the different perspectives and views, and therefore getting people together to support initiative has always been a critical challenge. So you end up making one step and people pull in all different directions. But to answer your question, yes, we have always looked at the research. Some of those discussions that I spoke about at the level of the ministry, of course, will certainly look at, brought on board some of those research areas and things that we needed to do, of course, and then the issues would arise with what would be the requirements and can we fund it. And another critical area is even when we start the initiative, often resources are pulled and then you end up, not being able to complete what you set out to do.
Nice. And we have World Bank scholars that refer to the 6 A's in education. And we have spoken at length about things like autonomy. We've spoken about the attention to teachers. Can we talk a bit about the attention to early childhood care and how critical do you see that improvement in that area?
When we participated in the Pearl study, one of the things that came out of the study for us is that students who attended ECCE actually sustained an advantage in literacy throughout their school life. And therefore, early childhood care and education is extremely important. It's really where those early years make a big difference in transition throughout the school system. One of the things that I was working on with the ECC division just prior to left is putting in a quality assurance system and looking at standards for ECC. So that I think that will actually contribute towards significantly improving the way we do business at the ECC level.
Excellent. And we spoke about research, and you would have mentioned the Pearl study. In terms of the PISA, would any research in terms of the PISA study, would that have contributed to decision-making at the level of the Ministry of Education?
The Pearl study, I think where we participated earlier with the Pearl study, and therefore there was a lot more time in terms of incorporating elements of that in terms of pedagogy and strategies for addressing literacy, etc. The Pearl study, however, while we would have looked at it in terms of informing some of the workshops and the training sessions we've done, I think the results came out at a point where we're in transition between what I call a policy cycle, and therefore not so much, and right there a decision I think was made not to move forward with the PISA study. But I think those international studies actually provide a lot of data for us and which can inform our way forward.
Excellent. And would you advise that we look more closely at the PISA report in driving our change initiatives?
Well, certainly. I think there are policy recommendations within the PISA study that can certainly inform our move forward. Let me say this, however, and I think it's important for people to understand, because you see crisis in education and it hits the media and it gives the impression that nothing is being done. When I became Chief Education Officer, we had performance of students at the secondary level, and this is where the PISA study would have targeted. We had students getting 5 and more subjects, with math and English being, I think, about the lowest, about 35%. We had students passing 5 and more, any 5 subjects being around 42%. And through a number of the initiatives, including focusing on school-based management, we have put in a clinical supervision initiative to deal with teaching and learning, etc. In 2020, we've actually moved, we have had, I think it's about 70 or 71% of our students getting grades 1, 2, and 3 in the subjects written. We've had about 61% getting 5 and more subjects, and the number getting 5 and more with math and English, I think, is around 55 or 56%. So we've seen progress. Yes. I think the issue is sustainability and institutionalization of some of the intervention. And as I said, we've had real challenges, particularly over the last 4 years, in terms of both financial support for some of the initiatives, and also in terms of personnel. We've had a number of vacancies not being filled or not being filled in a timely manner. And on the other side, you're dealing with a system with a very aged plant, so that there are tremendous infrastructural issues that you have to deal with, and those things would have impacted, so that on the policy side, you have a clear pathway that you want to go in terms of the practical situation and implementation. You are faced with challenges, and therefore, how do you bring those together to get the best out of what you can do?
Yes. And you have given mention to the clinical observation initiative more than once this evening. However, a lot of our teachers see the clinical observation initiative as punitive, and they perceive it as non-developmental in some cases. Is there anything that can be done to improve the practice of clinical observations?
Well, I can tell you, in terms of the planning, which I would have been intimately involved in, it was never meant to be punitive. In fact, it was supposed to be developmental. And therefore, looking at issues around building relationships within schools and looking at the whole process in terms of how it is done, providing feedback to teachers in terms of improving the whole teaching and learning experience. I think that's where the focus has been. Of course, in rolling out initiatives, depending on who is the person at the point, may lead to some of those issues arising. One of the things I indicated to persons rolling out, and even to principals, is that this is not about performance appraisal. Certainly at some point you will want teachers to be accountable, but this is about improving and looking at the instructional strategies that teachers are using in the classroom, looking at student engagement, looking at the assessment and strategies that are being used in the classroom. And really that is what the focus has to be in terms of the clinical or instructional approaches within the school.
And I really do hope that that bit of advice is echoed through the ears of our leaders, so that we're able to improve that clinical observation experience for our teachers as we seek to improve their performance and the performance of their students. As we get ready to close this evening's conversation, Mr. Seecharan, can you tell me, in your experience as Chief Education Officer, what are some of the greatest lessons you take away from that experience? And also, is there anything you would have done differently?
Yeah, well, I think I would have liked to see, for example, the ICT policy and the rollout of that further advance. Yes. In fact, if we had gotten the support that was required, maybe some of the issues related to COVID would have, yes, been minimized. So the ICT is one, but I think, in terms of where we started and looking at student performance and the results, we recognize that there were significant challenges at the level of the school in terms of management and leadership at the level of the school. And I'm not saying principal, I'm saying management and leadership or administration at the level of the school. I think that is an area, and maybe I would have liked to see the school-based management model rolled out. We were just at the point of building in a piece of that with the quality assurance side of it, but utilizing persons within the system, at the level of the school rather than just externally mandated. I think that would add significantly in terms of going forward. I think we've targeted a number of those areas which are critical to moving schools to becoming effective. And certainly those are areas I would have really liked to see move further, but I guess there's still the possibility of that happening.
Well, Mr. Seecharan, I want to thank you so much for spending this time this evening, sharing your experiences and expertise with us. And I am confident that these insights will definitely lead us into the right direction in terms of achieving radical reform in education in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Mr. Seecharan.
You're welcome.
Okay, there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Sharing from Mr. Seecharan on his experience as CEO of the Ministry of Education. Mr. Seecharan really shared quite a bit on his life in pursuit of educational reform. We got an inside view of what I would like to call the trials and tribulations, maybe, of decision-making at the CEO level. But I would like to say instead, a look maybe at the administrative side of planning and implementing educational reform. A large chunk of that decision-making was data collection, he said. Moving research to the level of the school was one intervention he would have liked to maximize. Financial constraints and policy cycles were also challenges. Teacher quality and teacher training he sees to be at the core of our education system. And induction for new teachers and the ICT policy are recent initiatives, as well as literacy and numeracy training. But lack of funding, he says, needs much creativity. And COVID has highlighted the social inequities in the system. Challenges in terms of capacity, in terms of filling vacancies, and the ability to manage initiatives and change should be targeted. Mr. Seecharan has really provided us with a solid picture of the workings of the Ministry of Education in terms of research, best practice, local context, and challenges. So now we move on to the segment where you as the audience have an opportunity to pose questions. And I have a couple of questions here, which I can pose on your behalf to Mr. Seecharan. Someone is asking, can we adopt or adapt some of the international models in terms of curriculum streams, like specialized secondary schools? One attendee mentioned the Dutch system, and another attendee referred to the British Virgin Islands focus on life skills. Is it that schools should have specializations, you think? Mr. Seecharan?
Yeah, the first part of your question in terms of adapting models, I certainly think there is the opportunity to look at some of those as we do a rethink of the education system. But before we do that, I think we have to get clear at the level of the country what it is we are trying to accomplish. I think Principal highlighted that what it is we are trying to accomplish in the country, and therefore utilizing appropriate models, certainly with adaptation, etc., can in fact be utilized.
Mm-hmm. Yes, with adaptation for sure. And there's another question concerning the ECC level and the primary system. One attendee wants to know whether we should consider implementing approaches used in the ECCE level in the primary school system.
Well, what I can tell you is, as part of our attempt to bridge the gap between ECC and primary school, in designing the primary school curriculum, we went back to the ECC in terms of integrating some of what is done at the ECC level into the early primary level. So that is in fact is part of what the ministry has on the ground. Of course, as I indicated, the challenges to implementation when the focus is on math and language arts tends to derail that. But I agree with the question in that we need to do more of that so that the transition from ECC to primary is a smoother one.
The bridge. Okay, and there's another question. How can we ensure that our children are guided towards meaningful developmental and productive career paths, professions that will foster national and sustainable development relative to the National Development Needs List?
Well, you're talking about the whole dealing with the entire system.
Yes.
I just want to mention here, because we are having this discussion in the context of radical education reform. Some of the changes that have taken place, and some persons have indicated that the change in technology over the last year has probably moved ahead by at least 10 years, or if not more. That has impacted on basically how we do business in every sphere of operations, use of artificial intelligence, increase in processing speeds, and the use of large data sets, move to green energy, so that while we can go back to what we have and say, okay, you need to go in this direction or in that, I think I would prefer to say that I think we are at a critical juncture now where we need to revisit, because a lot of we're talking about autonomous vehicles. Just imagine how many jobs will become redundant with that.
Yeah.
We need to do that rethink quickly so that we can actually prepare our citizens for those areas that are available or will be available.
Yes, futuristic employment. And I think I will ask one more question on behalf of the audience at this stage. Are you aware of any challenges with university entrance and so on, any tertiary education institution that require attention at the primary or secondary school level? In other words, our tertiary entrance students' potential, are they lacking in any way? Has this come to your attention at all?
Well, we've had a discussion at various levels in the ministry and with, I guess, even with some of the tertiary level institutions. But I think we are in a cycle where the persons who are responsible for preparing our students to move to the next level are being trained at the tertiary level. So that I think in moving that discussion forward, we need to address those issues, but those issues can't be addressed within the ministry alone. We also have to look, that's why I emphasize the issue of teacher preparation. We need to have teachers in the system with the requisite competencies to actually bring about those changes that we are talking about.
Okay, and I think I will still add one last question, because I myself am interested in this, and it leads on naturally from what you just said. That question is, where is the support to encourage teachers to develop and maintain a high standard in teaching?
I think one of the weaknesses we have in the system, and I think Professor Copeland spoke to it in terms of the model where rather than looking at promoting innovation and development in schools, we've tended in the past to look at more punitive ways. I think we need to look at, and certainly through teacher training, encourage and foster teachers to develop themselves. That could be done in a number of ways through either incentives or facilitating programs and making those available for teachers. So it's an area within the entire teacher education sphere that needs to be looked at and strengthened as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you, audience, for your participation, and thanks to Mr. Seecharan for so ably responding. Hopefully responding to the audience wasn't as challenging as his former portfolio. Thanks again. Our lead presenter today is Dr. Freddie James, who is a lecturer in educational leadership at the School of Education, UWI St. Augustine. She is a University of Warwick postgraduate research fellowship scholar and is focused on embedding innovation and entrepreneurship into the teaching and learning process. She is currently involved in an international project focused on creating social entrepreneurship to fight poverty. Dr. James is vice chairman of the CARICOM team responsible for developing and implementing standards for school leaders and teachers, and is also the president and founder of the Caribbean Visionary Educators Foundation, which empowers educators to create, curate, and circulate Indigenous Caribbean-focused educational content. Dr. James will address the question, are we ready for radical educational reform in Trinidad and Tobago? Just to remind you, audience, your participation will be invited at the end of all 4 presentations and not before. So please make your notes to refer to at that point. And I now invite Dr. James to make a contribution.
Who would have thought that this day would come? This day where we confront the really deep philosophical question, are we ready for radical educational reform and its implications? Do we even know what that means? Do we dare to imagine it? 2 great writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Kai Miller, say that imagination is the greatest asset as human beings. They say without it, there is no hope, and without hope, there can be no change. This evening, I will take you on a journey of imagination. And we start that journey with some truths. I would like to express to you some truths. Truth number 1, teaching is really hard work. It requires creativity, knowledge, skills, and empathy. The kind of emotional intelligence that is not easily acquired. Secondly, the second truth, teaching is a work of heart. And I want to repeat that one. Teaching is a work of heart. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How do we transform education? My answer to this question is we need a new approach. The approaches we've been using have not been working. And we must have a foundation. Everybody knows if you build a house on a bad foundation, it is going to fall down. So what is the foundation? My thesis is, if the goal of education is learning for educators and the students, then to transform education, we must transform learning. Let me repeat. if the goal of education is learning for educators and students, then to transform education, we must transform learning. And I know some of you brilliant folks in the audience are already asking, well, what is learning? You know, what therefore do we have to transform? And I want to offer this model as a different view. Now, this whole webinar and this symposium is not about telling you what to do. It is a discourse that we will have. And from this discourse, if we're really serious, a number of us will come together to really chart a way forward, because the way forward should be charted by one person or one entity. So let's just examine 21st century learning, this concept as provided by one writer. And I'm going to start with the humanistic knowledge, the knowledge to value, because I feel this is most important. Life to value, life and job skills, ethical, emotional awareness, cultural competence. These are all 21st century learnings, things we need to learn, things we need to value. So this has to figure into the teaching learning environment. Secondly, I will go to foundational knowledge to know, digital ICT literacy, core content knowledge, cross-disciplinary knowledge. And the third segment is the meta-knowledge, or the knowledge. When you have this acquired your knowledge to act. So you're taking the content knowledge to a different level. And at this level is where we will have what I call impact in the system, where people begin to act. Creativity and innovation features here, problem solving and critical thinking, communication and collaboration. Now, a lot of the buzzwords that we hear, but let's go down a little deeper and look at the OECD's 7 principles of learning. And this is important. So I really am going to read through, and I really want you to take a good and different look at something that is providing an opportunity to interfere, as I would say, with the thing between your two ears, because that's really what this whole symposium is about. We really want to interfere with the thing between your two ears and get that going. So learners are at the center, of course. The learning environment recognizes learners as its core participants, encourages their active engagement, and develops in them an understanding of themselves as learners. I'm going to read that last part again. To develop an understanding of themselves as learners. So we see we begin with human development, people development, understanding self. Then there's the social nature of learning. And we all experiencing that now and trying to make sure that we can bring that social aspect of learning and that social nature of learning into the classrooms, the remote classrooms, and through in the process of remote teaching and learning. The learning environment is founded on the social nature of learning and actively encourages well-organized cooperative learning. Notice not just individualistic learning, but cooperative learning. Emotions are integral to learning. The learning professionals within the learning environment are highly attuned to the learner's motivations and the key role of emotions in achievement. Recognizing learning differences. But even before I go to that, so if we understand the emotions of people, then we will understand that one of the things we have to do in the teaching learning environment is to create a psychologically safe environment where people feel it's okay to fail, but to fail fast and be resilient. The fourth point, recognizing individual differences. The learning environment is acutely sensitive to the individual differences among the learners in it, including their prior knowledge. Assessment for learning. The learning environment operates with clarity of expectations, using assessment strategies consistent with these expectations. There's a strong emphasis on formative feedback to support learning. An emphasis on formative feedback to support learning, not just summative feedback. The tests and tests and tests and tests. Stretching all students. The learning environment devises learning opportunities that demand hard work and challenge from all, but without excessive overload. So what this model is advancing is not to have children just sit down and you accept mediocrity from them, but you challenge them to do the best they can be. But in challenging them is a recognition of your expectations of them being somebody and becoming somebody and something in life. So that, you don't sit and say, he can't do any better than that. She can't do any better than that. No, he or she comes from X, Y, and Z environment. No. So therefore, you don't give them any sort of challenge. You don't give them opportunities to show you what they can do. And finally, building horizontal connections, which is extremely important. The learning environment strongly promotes horizontal connectedness across areas of knowledge, skill, and subjects, as well as to the community and the wider world. You would realize that any person in a teaching learning environment who is very subject-oriented, I am teaching mathematics, that is what I do, cannot be successful in the long-term guidance of young people to becoming, because the nature of the world is built on connectedness. Look at what happened in the Suez Canal the other day. That's just a good one example. How one boat not being able to go through the channel, blocking that channel. Look at the spill-off effect of that one boat, and how that in itself showed the huge connectedness of the world, and how, if we don't recognize that, what will happen. Now, I also want us to take a look at what a learning environment should look like, what learning should look like, in any environment. We have to be paying attention to attitudes and values. We have to look at the cultural aspects of the persons in the learning environment. And it's not only the students, it's all persons within the learning environment. We have to pay attention to the social interactions. And the social interactions don't only have to be face-to-face, they can be online social interactions as well. And interactions with different persons, interactions between students and teachers, between teachers and principal, between school and community, etc. And then we must have the psychomotor, the doing. And I know that many teachers are trained and they come out and they write their lesson plans and somehow forget to do a psychomotor or an affective objective. And I'm saying all are important because we learn by doing. We learn most by doing. And of course, the content must be relevant. The content must be inspiring. The content must be interesting. And then this aspect of being intellectual. And this particular piece is so important. I really want to stress what it means to be intellectual and not just bright. I'm not just talking about being bright, but intellectual has to do with your thinking. It has to do with coming up with ideas. And what I've done, it's so important. I think it's so important. I've put this intellectual traits up for people to see, and you will see how much content knowledge figures into this. You have integrity, you have humility, you have confidence in reason, perseverance, fair-mindedness, courage, empathy, autonomy. These are the traits. These are intellectual traits. Sorry. So we operating in the realm of thinking, and our connectedness has to be with thinking. And a lot of how we think comes from how we feel. But we do have to consider how do these thoughts, because we are experts talking things, you have the technocrats who would be saying certain things, but how do these thoughts align with the knowledge and beliefs of practitioners on the ground? This has to be the key question, and this is the million-dollar question to bringing about any kind of radical reform in our education system. Because and this question is so very important, because the actual implementation of new approaches to teaching and learning will be determined by the knowledge and beliefs of practitioners. We could preach Paul, as people say, and we can argue Saul as experts, but when it comes down to the crux of the matter, it is those who are implementing. They will implement what they know and what they believe. So we have to ask ourselves, are we thinking together, the experts, the technocrats, the practitioners, the wider community? Are we thinking together, or are we thinking apart? This will let us know how ready we are for this radical education change. And what would be the implications if we do have radical education change? And I'm saying the change has to come where we focus on learning. We recognize that teaching is a work of art. And we recognize that teaching involves empathy, integrity, gaining knowledge. And it's not to impart that knowledge. We like to say impart knowledge. You can't impart any knowledge to anybody. Knowledge is something that has to be taken, it's not given. Somebody has to want that knowledge. So how do we connect? What we have to do is to connect the dots. And that's the main thing, getting that connection. We saw when the pandemic started, what we saw was a lack of alignment. Some people were powerless to act, many having to face their fears of a lack of knowledge, competence, and for some, a lack of will. Many fears with a lack of understanding, because the languaging, one of the things that we have to be mindful of is our languaging of change, our languaging of new approaches. We have to speak in a language that everybody can understand. We have to speak the language that will help people understand. And that kind of language comes from the heart. It comes from when you respect somebody and you respect the language that they speak, and you don't say, well, I don't understand what you're not speaking standard English, and therefore how you speaking, I'm not understanding. Or people will say to us as experts, you only talk in theory, I don't understand when you talk theory, bring it down to my level so that I can understand. So yes, many fears were recognized, and the language issues are a very important issue. And we have to therefore connect these dots with a different kind of language and a different kind of languaging. So in terms of the implications, I've put them in as pillars. First, a vision of human development. If we are to have this radical reform, it will require a vision of human development. So my question is, are you ready for that vision of human development? Secondly, we would need to have an alignment of knowledge and beliefs of practitioners, experts, and technocrats. Are you ready for that alignment? Thirdly, we would have to do design-based professional learning to create products, not just to talk and we have our greatest resources in front of us and we just sit and chat and have them regurgitate what we want them to regurgitate, whereas they could be creating products. They could be creating real solutions to solve problems. Are we ready for that? Then we need to have servant leadership at all levels. Are we ready for that? And change, a radical change, will have implications for how and who we recruit. Are we ready for that? Are we prepared to do a pre-service DPED alongside an in-service DPED so that we acknowledge that the standard should be pre-service? Are we ready for that? How we value educators, for example, pay structures across ECC, primary and secondary. Are we ready to say that across the sectors, people should be prepared and decide which sector they will go into, whether it's ECC, primary or secondary? And are we ready to say we pay equally? Are we ready for that? In terms of the curriculum, are we ready to build a curriculum that fosters an innovative learning environment where students feel empowered and teachers inspire, and where communities come together to take part in the building of a generation that is going to enhance the living conditions for all of us in society? Are we ready for that? Are we ready for timetabling for collaboration and research? Timetabling in your school timetable. Are we ready for that? And how about connecting schools and communities within a district where we focus on our children and not my children or the children in my school or my child or my children? Are we really ready for that? We feel the system is too big, too complex to change. But you know what? We are the system, all of us. So if we want the system to change, what do we have to do? I think you can answer that question. We have to change. As Barack Obama says, change will not come if we wait for it, or if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. My question to you is, are you ready? I'm ready. Peace out. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Dr. James. We thank her for her thought-provoking ideas and for stimulating us to think about the challenges of educational reform from a realistic perspective. There are certainly ideas there that are worth pursuing. Without imagination, there is no hope. Without hope, there is no change. we must transform learning to transform education. Dr. James wants us to think about 7 principles of learning in order to start conceptualizing where educational reform could begin. So, are we ready? And coming up now, we have 3 responses to the notion of being ready for educational reform. As they say, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've come from. So let me introduce you to the person who will now elaborate on where we've come from in terms of systemic reform in the past. Professor Jerome Delisle is a professor of educational leadership and the current director of the School of Education at the Faculty of Humanities and Education at St. Augustine. He is a researcher and consultant of international repute in the areas of educational policy, system reform, and educational assessment. He has published in several top-tier educational leadership journals on various issues, including high poverty schools and improving school systems in the global South. Professor Delisle will now elaborate on a time when reform meant no change, and he will take us through the SEMP and seamless initiatives. Professor Delisle, on to you now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm delighted that coming at the end of my career, and of course I started very early because I had a PhD at 33, I can look back and see what changes have took place. And there was someone here called R.H.E. Braffett, a former head director, and he loved this quotation. It's French. You know, my name is in French. I don't like French, so it's French. But basically it means the more things change, the more they remain the same. And yet, for us to create a future, we must study the past. So I'm studying the past with you very quickly. It's going to be a rapid study event. We look at the reforms that have occurred, those large funded reforms, 150 million, etc. And we see basically from 1960 to 2019, basically 4 major reforms, and the last being the SEMP and the seamless. SEMP was a sector reform, meaning that it dealt with the secondary sector only, but seamless applied to the whole system. And the purpose of seamless, believe it or not, was to remove the seams in the system. But immediately you understand the joke because there are still seams, and the seams have become even more seamed. So what has happened after all these years? You still have an 11 plus. Yes, there's a different name, but how is it different to the original 11 plus, except that everybody goes forward, but some people go to some schools. You have the CXC now, still used for certification. The governance systems have remained unchanged. Even what Dr. James talked about in terms of the pedagogy, that hasn't changed much. And in fact, SEMP included something called TALS, which was meant to change pedagogy. Sadly as well, we have more failures. So I told you that when we look at 2006 and now, we are seeing improvements in the system. You have more 1s and more 2s, and you have a slight decrease in the grades that we don't want. What we do want to say is that you don't necessarily have to have change. Sometimes you have a change that disappears, transient change. And sometimes you have change that, like you change your name, but you're the same person, nominal. And so reform have a whole range of directions. And we have to be careful looking in the past, because many of our changes are in fact they have not been sustained. They are momentary, they are nominal, they're transient. When we look at the 2019, and I often show this graph, those little bubbles are what? schools, the thing below is what? Socioeconomic status. And immediately you realize that the schools which are lower down to the left in socioeconomic status, those are the schools, secondary schools, that are not doing well. So firstly, there's a gap between schools, and secondly, you can predict the gap in achievement by means of SES. That is the situation. It's just as Cross and Schwarzbaum studied in 1969. If you read that study, I don't think you want to go and look for it, but if you read that study, I have this study, I've read it so many times, it's the exact pattern. And so when you look at the school system, what you have is basically 4 different models of schools. Each time we build a school, we attach another model onto it, and we say, if you're good, you go there. If you're bad, you go there. When we look at poverty across the schools, we realize we compare 20 countries here. One, the main thing is, I know we can't see everything, but we don't have much time. There's a large achievement gap between the schools in Trinidad and Tobago, as large as in Argentina. And secondly, socioeconomic status between schools explain that gap. That's exactly what Cross and Schwarzbaum found. They didn't have all the techniques. This is multi-level modeling. They didn't have all these techniques, but they found the same thing. In terms of failures, when we examine it very carefully, this is the concern, and this is what we don't see. We look only at people doing well, and fine, I love to do well, and I love the children who do well too, but if you have this group of, all the reds are people who are below the standard, why would the system be putting out so many persons who are not meeting the standard? That's a concern. So this is fine, and I love this picture. I will even put it up. But is that our major concern? Or is this our concern? This study is not done by me. This was done by one of the departments in UWI, school dropouts. It's linked, it's all over the country. It's linked to poverty. And that data is quite clear. We made a statement in one of the parliamentary meetings. Many gang members are high school dropouts who come from low-income socially disorganized families. We didn't do that study. That's there. Are we happy? Is this what we want? So what explains this persistent failure at change? No, we are not Hong Kong, Singapore, Finland, or Ontario. These countries have different contexts, yes, but they all share a very strong commitment to success at education reform. It's not that they're better than us. Singapore, for example, is mortally afraid of being left a country in the future without a place. They don't have resources. That's why they change the education system. They don't want to be left behind. If boys are treated, then you'll never be left behind. So countries have worked and worked and worked. When I wrote this concept note before, I used the word radical reform. I was really trying to understand what the Prime Minister was saying. And I know that the word transformative, when you look at it in terms of how we use it technically, it means a change that is radical. But people begin to get frightened. Radical, what do you mean? He means he going on, well, okay. That's how Finland became number 1. They had a radical reform in 1960. I'm not saying that we should do any radical reform. I'm just saying I'm a technician. You can't learn from what you haven't done. So if you look back, what change have we done? CSE, we reverted. API, we stopped it, except in Tobago. So if we haven't done something successfully, if we haven't made 3 centuries, we're going to make a 200 now? And then you have to learn from your failures. And that means, why did this not occur? Did we have a post-mortem to understand why SEM, what went wrong with SEM? Why did the NCSC fail? Why did the PCR in Seamless? Why is it not working? Can we discuss that? No, we don't like to discuss. We want to quarrel. We want to fight. We want to go on one side and the next side. Please don't go against me. I will say anything to please you. Then you can't forget, you know, in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, she said, you know, she was in a prime. For some people, the prime is 1960s, the colonial times. You remember QRC, I'm in QRC, St. Mary's, you know, they want to go back to that. Well, all right. You have it back, go back to it, and then leave everybody there. If you want to change, you can have a little change. Just change and make sure that I can go QRC. So you want a special kind of change, you know? So you want to bathe and put on your dirty clothes again. Think about it. I don't know what the change will be. That's for a country to think about. But we are here to support, learn something new. So when we theorize about why we were not changing at the rates, because of course, I mean, this is our profession. We do system reform. We go all over the world. We see all these countries. We see how they change. We hear them talking and boasting and saying, well, they don't boast, they're saying what they did. Why are we not changing that quickly? A good example was the policy, the task force report. People remember, people use the same frame of reference to interpret. Okay, so Mr. Pandey had a chance and fine, he did the best that he could, excellent. He said, listen committee, I am going to send everybody to school in 2001, find a way to remove the common entrance. And no, we need that because we need a device to say who goes where. Well, all right, you have that. Sometimes you have to forget. Sometimes you have to forget. Sometimes you have to remember. Similar with SBM. School-based management, we've been doing that for years. There were debates. My mentor, my supervisor was Ewart Taylor. He was the secretary of this, was the secretary, the vice chairman of this, the white paper. They were talking about that. I said, I don't even hear that. I don't want to get into that. Back to 2019, have we really made progress in terms of decentralization and school-based management? Okay. I had the absolute joy of being the closeout evaluator for SEMP. I identified 3 potholes after the project was ended and I began to theorize. Connectedness, people weren't connected to the reforms. They said, SEMP, what's SEMP? Well, it involves me. Ambiguity, what to do? Stringency. Now, it was important to me because prior to that, I thought, well, okay, where to get these consultants from? The consultants for teacher education, for example, was Simon Fraser. And Simon Fraser is one of the best universities they're from Canada in terms of teacher education. And fantastic a plan, very specific, very detailed. Could the technocrats read it? So that's a problem. The system must learn. We're never going to get back better again. You can't wish that you can have a batter if you do want to have a batter. So what you do need to do is to move forward. And that involves remembering from the past what to do good and forgetting what inhibited you. That means reflecting. And so the system itself, not you personally, the system itself has to learn. And we call that type of learning double loop learning. When we learn enough to go back at our assumptions, Now, I'm not saying Singapore is better than you, but of course I study systems, so I just have to say that what the Singaporean people have tried to do is that they said, okay, fine, we like exams bad. What do we have to do to survive in the future? So they go back not just to their strategies, but to the assumptions, and let those assumptions drive the strategies. In terms of future reform, we do encourage the new thinking now is to go even further than that, to see yourself in the ideal situation in the future, so-called presencing. And that is part of what we call triple loop learning. Men like Senge, etc., who talk about that level of learning. It involves you, as Dr. James said, and Terry, you shows that for us to make a leap as a country, individuals have to make that leap too. They have to make that leap mentally, and they have to be able to see themselves and leave the past. Suspend, redirect, let go, and the critical learning concept of presencing so that they can move forward. It's both an individual and it's a group. Has Trinidad reached that stage as yet? I am not going to answer that. I'm saying that is what the country has to do rather than to look at each other and to fight and say, well, I wouldn't get this and I wouldn't get that. We have to move forward. And yes, Mr. Seecharan is right as well. We have to understand what the data says. We just can't keep saying, but I want this, or my family wants this. What does the data say? If you have close to 50% of persons not meeting the standard in terms of reading at 15 plus, what does that data say? What does it mean for us? I closed on by telling you about maybe a reform that I thought that was maybe advice as we move towards a think tank, the Scottish reform, and the people from Scotland have tried to work especially against inequity. And you see, they've kind of worked out that this is what we need in terms of schools, in terms of practice, as Dr. James says. So it's a very coherent set of reform, even as they prepare now to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, which, don't forget, we have to make a plan for that, right? No more webinars, we have to make a plan for that. They've kind of worked out, well, this is how we're going to go about education recovery. So we have to pull ourselves together and learn and work together, and hopefully we will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Delisle. Your presentation helps us to get a picture of where we are now in terms of educational reform. And it sets us thinking about nominal transient change and what next in terms of radical educational reform. Some lessons for us. Learn from our failures. A little tiny change won't work. Professor Delisle mentioned lack of connectedness to reforms. The system must remember from the past, but forget what inhibited improvement. Reflecting on assumptions is important, and country and individual must make the necessary mental leap. Our second response to the idea of radical educational reform comes from an educator whom we might deem to hold perspectives from the more youthful end of the expert spectrum. We consider her contribution to represent what might be seen to be a futuristic look at educational reform locally from a social justice standpoint. Dr. Renelle Lee-Piggott is also a lecturer in educational leadership at the School of Education. Her research interests and publications focus on principal leadership and development, social justice leadership, schools facing disadvantaged circumstances, school culture, and school improvement. A former primary school teacher, Dr. Lee Piggott, is also an academic journal reviewer and a trained educational institution evaluator. We look forward to her response entitled, Achieving Social Justice in My Lifetime. Over to you, Dr. Lee Piggott.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yamin Ali, and a pleasant good evening to everyone. I've been tasked with considering if social justice in our education system can be achieved in my lifetime. So please indulge me a moment as you consider this question. Have you ever been made to feel excluded from quality opportunities, silenced over issues that directly affect you, robbed of what was rightfully yours, powerless to change the circumstances around you, or even hated just for being you? Many of us have at one point or another, but many of our students and their families are experiencing these things right now. In their homes, in their communities, in their schools, in our nation. It may have been because of other persons' notions, beliefs, values about their gender, ethnicity, complexion, socioeconomic status, citizenship status, disability, language, social class, age, body shape, political affiliation, religion, or even sexual orientation. And I know that was a mouthful, but the point I'm trying to make is that in-groups and out-groups exist, and they've always existed. They are context-specific, systemic, and cultural. In terms of social justice, these experiences are recognized to be issues of marginalization, segregation, inequity, discrimination, and as I said earlier, exclusion from high-quality learning experiences and opportunities. Martin Luther King once said, "Injustice anywhere is threat to justice everywhere." I like this quote because it reminds us that a them versus us mentality is unwise. Yet, some of our schools have to deal with higher concentrations of social justice issues than other schools. Some of our schools are in disrepair. They are under-resourced, provide lower quality learning experiences for students, riddled with deficit thinking about children and their families, all within enduring and toxic school cultures. Permit me again, please, to engage you with this question. In our society, who do these schools generally serve? A frightening thought is that because of the effects of the global crises, such as those due to the COVID-19 pandemic, such circumstances that perpetuate inequities and inequalities and injustices are likely to increase and have increased as governments worldwide, in their effort to stabilize themselves, reduce financial supports, and adopt neoliberal stances and policies which result in a separation between the state and social realities, and which emphasize the privatization, commodification, and commercialization of public education. The result of that would be an increasingly pervasive perception of education as a need that can be provided by those with the capital to do so, to be accessed by those who alone can afford it. I'm sure that you can see the problem with that. The problem is that quality education will no longer be viewed as a human right of every child. Thus, more and more children would be unable to access quality education which means our nation will likely see more and more social ills affecting us all if we don't take stock of ourselves. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But there is hope. Much is being done. And this evening, I want to highlight the efforts of school principals who face more than their fair share of social justice issues daily and demonstrate what we call in the literature as social justice leadership. So this figure here attempts to capture the work of 6 primary and secondary school principals in dealing with social justice issues related specifically to socioeconomic disadvantage within our local context. The broader study actually was qualitative and consisted of 11 principals. But in the absence of no formal policy or training to guide them on how to address social justice issues, these principles show that even though they were not all always sure about their social justice leadership orientation, their values for respect, equity, their demonstrations of love and care saw them taking steps to reposition marginalized students through acting as surrogates for many of our students, co-opting stakeholders who would help meet their students' basic needs, and at times personally teaching students themselves in order to narrow the achievement gaps that Professor Delay would have referred to. These principles were found to also target hindering mindsets and deficit thinking of some parents, some students, and even teachers. But the needs of so many of our students are so great and enduring that the work that these principles do leave them with very little time and energy to strategically plan for any kind of improvement in their schools. And many times their efforts go unrecognized and unrewarded, as we as a country pay disproportionately greater attention to academic performance, the top 100 lists, and to scholarship winners. But although the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated nations, it functioned as a critical incident that heightened our awareness of the diverse pressing needs of thousands of our learners. And it has given us a better understanding of the kinds of pedagogical and technological needs of our teachers and the ingenuity needed by our school leaders. However, in these times, we have also seen promising responses, such as, the ministry's consultations and webinars such as these. We've also seen more attention to data-driven decision-making and even activism and donations and so on within the public domain and in private circles that demonstrate steps towards transforming our education system. So there is hope. But as much as these are commendable and much needed activities, we have also realized that they are simply just not enough, and that some of these activities are even unsustainable. So what can we do? How can we transform our education system to one that is socially just, inclusive, and equitable? And I'll just focus on just 3 points this evening. We first need to take an honest look at our education system and ask deep searching questions, such as, what is the purpose of education in Trinidad and Tobago? Who is being served? Does every child have access to high quality educational experiences? And if not, what policies, practices, and pervading thinking seem to be contributing to the existing perpetual inequity and injustice in our society? Are we accurately prioritizing the distribution of resources so that equitable education can be attained? And after we've identified those hard questions that need to be addressed, we then need to, of course, answer them. So those questions, we need to answer them as honestly and completely as we can through collaborative, cross-sectoral efforts such as, stakeholder dialogues, through meta-analyses of past and existing education policies, that looking backwards that Professor Delal would have spoken to, and through credible research evidence. That thinking together that Dr. James spoke of. So we need to think that collaboration is highly needed. Those answers could then be used to forge a strong, enabling, and inclusive vision of our education system, which would be informed by the economic and social development needs of our country, and to which all education change initiatives and efforts will be aligned. Secondly, more attention needs to be paid to the capacity building, support, and effectiveness of our school leaders. In order for this to happen, we need to have and use documented standards for school leaders. And you would have heard Dr. James refer to those standards earlier. That includes standards that, and these standards, I'm saying, need to also include standards that speak to social justice. We will need to facilitate the development of leadership capacity in a number of areas, including, of course, social justice leadership, because those who lead must themselves be just. In order to lead their schools to success, the literature bears out that school leaders need to understand and name unjust practices that deprive school members of their rights and dignity. They must also take action to change school structures that perpetuate injustices. Of course, this means that they must have a certain degree of autonomy and exercise a great measure of accountability in order to ensure inclusive learning environments. Also, school leaders must also be willing to confront any of their own biases and assumptions about others in order to practice and model socially just principles. So leaders have to look inwardly as well. Thirdly, from a social justice perspective, again, it is important that we act deliberately on narrowing those achievement gaps through a comprehensive approach that targets our most vulnerable school populations and underperforming schools. And you would have heard from Mr. Seecharan that the ministry has begun doing this kind of thing. Such an approach would focus on meeting the diverse needs of those students and their families that are most in need or who are unable to help themselves until they are able to stand on their own feet, because perpetual welfare should not be encouraged. Such an approach will also include more equitable distribution of resources so that the schools that need more get more. Of course, homeschool community partnerships and school networks where schools can learn from each other and support each other will be instrumental. So to return to the question with which I began, can we achieve social justice in my lifetime? I believe that where there is a will, there will be a way. And I think that many of us have the will. And so together, collaboratively, we will find ways to improve the educational outcomes of the children of the most marginalized among us. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Lee Figgott. We certainly hope you live very long so that you can see the end of the road. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on radical reform in education and on the realities and challenges of creating an equitable education system for our children. Our children and our grandchildren, actually. But we are also grateful that you've opened our minds to the opportunities that lie ahead to reform our system. You pointed us to a way in which social justice leaders take things in their own hands sometimes without waiting for policy in order to act. But you said that this effort debilitates them to a great extent and they might not be sustainable. Who is being served seems to be the main question that needs to be asked. Collaborative cross-sectoral dialogues are advised. Standards for school leaders we look forward to, and especially those that focus on social justice. Thank you so much. Our third and final response to the issue of radical educational reform comes from Mr. Seecharan, who, having been in the belly of the system as former CEO, can respond to issues raised and possibly shed some light on how viable radical reform actually is. Mr. Seecharan, over to you again.
Thank you, Dr. Yamin Ali. Maybe I should start by saying that some of the initiatives that Dr. Delay spoke to was done prior to my being in the CEO's office. But notwithstanding, we can look at the issue of, are we ready for implementing radical reform in education? I think in doing so, we can look at some of the comparative analysis of education systems across the world who have successfully implemented and those where implementation wasn't as successful, to get some idea to the barriers. But before I go into that, I want to first of all just take one example of a successful reform and do a comparison with a similar exercise in Trinidad. So we get a sense of maybe what are some of the things, if we are thinking about radical reform, what we need to pay particular attention to. Germany some years ago implemented a national curricula and standards for curriculum. What did they do? They took time to engage stakeholders in the development, trial, and implementation of those standards. They developed resources for the implementation, including guidelines for instructional design, lesson plans, and pedagogy. And they developed capacity within the system to implement change. Now, I want to do a quick comparison with our primary school curriculum. The design was based on research. So we looked at the research in various areas, pedagogy, assessment, etc. Attempts were made to engage stakeholders. We did develop resources, guidelines for instructional change, lesson plans, etc. And the question is, so that there are similarities in terms of what Germany did to the process we started with from the design aspect, but we got different results. And the question is why? The first thing is that in developing curriculum, there are certain requirements, there are certain things that you need to factor in. So for example, to do the curriculum design properly, you needed to get the stakeholders involved in the process so that you get that initial buy-in, especially of teachers. In implementing that within our context, and given the policy cycle I spoke of earlier on, the timeline was changed, in other words, reduced. So you had to take some shortcuts and compress the time to develop the curriculum. We did resources and all of that, but part of the strategy to get stakeholder engagement would have been to conduct that in a number of pilot schools, and of course make adjustments, and then you move towards further implementation. Because of the need to work within your policy cycle, that was changed to full implementation. And again, because of the policy cycle, in terms of implementation and developing capacity, you had a pullback in terms of the funding available. And these are some of the real challenges and may explain some of the variation in success. The thing about it is that schools that are at a place where they can innovate and incorporate changes, they can do it. And those schools will move ahead because they have the requisite at the level of the school to move ahead. I'm saying this to say that we need to be cognizant of those issues that impact on the implementation of reform. And I want to share some of these. They are relevant to our context and maybe are lessons that we need to take forward. We had a number of suggestions in terms of areas that we need to address in any reform effort. And we have some issues that Dr. Delisle raised in terms of what we need to forget and what we need to remember. You know, the issue of educational reform has been compared to an iceberg, where what you see is just the top, the things that you need to do. And the majority of the iceberg, which is submerged, you don't see. So those issues really related to the interests, the beliefs, the motivation of all stakeholders, all impact significantly on any attempt to reform. So in terms of moving and implementing reform, and are we ready? The first thing that needs to happen is that we need, and I think the other speakers alluded to it, we need to have a clear vision about the aims of education. We need to engage stakeholders, especially teachers, in formulating and implementing policy responses. If teachers don't buy into any policy, any reform initiative, it is doomed to failure. And when sometimes you have multiple initiatives targeting the school at the same time, it leads to, as Dr. Delisle mentioned, a lot of confusion and a position which can be adopted by many teachers is we'll wait until the next reform takes place. We need to also be cognizant, and all political players and stakeholders need to develop realistic expectation about the pace and the nature of reform. Once we are involved in the reform process, the time lapse between the implementation and seeing the result is not very short. So it takes time. And therefore we have to be realistic in terms of the time that it will take. And therefore, in order to complete the process and see those outcomes and ensure that they are sustained, this is an important factor. Maybe there's a suggestion here for looking at a different approach to the policy cycle, which goes beyond 4 or 5 years and looks at continuity of an institutionalization of some of the reform initiatives. I think a couple of the other speakers addressed the issue of capacity development. You cannot implement successful change if your teachers and your administrators and other persons involved in the process are not adequately trained. There is therefore a significant case to be made in any reform initiative for the issue of capacity development, both for teachers and administrators in terms of implementing any reform initiative. Any reform initiative, and if it involves extensive teacher training and capacity development, requires adequate financing. And therefore, starting an initiative with the best plans for teacher training without the requisite financing to support it will achieve nothing. And therefore, we need to also look at the issue of financing educational reform within a reasonable time so that we can achieve the outcomes that we want. We also have to have the correct governance structures in place. Dr. Lelai spoke about confusion within the SEMP reform initiatives and lack of clarity. If you're implementing any educational reform, there must be clarity of roles and responsibilities and the governance structure to support that. We must have appropriate measures for monitoring reform objectives and goals and providing feedback. In other words, we need to build that culture of feedback into the process. And in this way, in rolling out a reform effort, you can also build in the capacity for changes and adjustment as you go forward. There is one other area, well, two other areas that I want to touch on, which have, and in my view, impacted significantly on past reform initiatives. And again, a number of speakers alluded to it. I think the principal also spoke to it. And the use of data. The use of data, I think, is critical, not only in developing policy and designing reform initiatives, but also in understanding the context and also informing the way forward. I think too often in the past, we have designed reform initiatives for this entire system without taking into context the context of schools and aviation. It is absolutely clear to us that schools operate in different contexts. There are differences in socioeconomic status, and we've seen the relationship between that and in terms of the outcomes that we get from schools. And therefore, that use of data is critical. I think one of the things as an education system that we have to address is that system for collecting data and analyzing it and providing appropriate feedback. We need to look at change management skills, developing change management skill in reform initiatives. There is one final area that I want to address. I think the last speaker addressed the issue of social justice. I think there is a need, if we are talking radical education transformation, there is a need for us to look at a whole government approach. We are looking within the education system to develop those skills and competencies and our human resource capital. But we can't do that in isolation in terms of other ministries, for example, the Ministry of Labor. Education reform requires financing so that the Ministry of Finance, some of the social justice issues and social issues, Ministry of Social Development. So I think there's a need for a whole government approach towards educational reform. In the absence of that, I think the best efforts, again, can result in us not moving anyway. So unless we help people recognize what needs to change, build a shared understanding and collective ownership for change, unless we focus resources, build capacity, and create the right policy climate with accountability measures designed to encourage innovation and development rather than compliance, and tackle institutional structures around interests and habits of administrators and educators rather than the learners, then we are not going anywhere. So that I want to submit in terms of whether we are ready for radical reform in education. I want to submit these are some of the areas that must underpin any effort to move forward. We need to know what, we can work out the how, but I think the comparative analysis of data across educational systems identifies not the issue of the plan, but the implementation and sustainability as the issues that we need to grapple with. And therefore, I submit that it is possible, but we need to take those lessons from the past and factor that in as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Seecharan. You've shared information with us about the implementation of reform from the ministry's perspective. For example, the journey of the primary school curriculum implementation. You've suggested that stakeholder involvement is important, especially teachers, and that you've admitted that there was a rush in terms of implementing that primary school curriculum, putting it in place. There was full implementation before time. And I must say that the whole government approach to educational reform is something we would like to see in our lifetime. Thank you, Mr. Seecharan, for taking us through many features of decision-making in education from the perspective of the upper end of the system hierarchy. I must say here that as CEO, you were always accommodating to the School of Education, and I'm sure to other stakeholders as well, when we sought meetings and consultations with you on various pressing issues. And here you are again today, facilitating rich discussion on reform in education in our country and suggesting a longer policy cycle as a partial possible solution. With that said, I'm going to now focus on some questions and comments from the audience. And I think we already have some in the chat. So I will have a look at those and direct them to the relevant presenters. In as much as we have Mr. Seecharan here, there was a question about a national policy on education for sustainable development. Is there one as part of the rollout of the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals? Mr. Seecharan, can you say anything about that? Is there a national policy on education for sustainable development?
Well, there's a policy that has been developed within the ministry. I think Professor Copeland alluded to it, which would really be the latest that the ministry has in terms of the direction that we wanted to move. Mm-hmm. It's the impact of COVID on that, and I guess the technological changes that have taken place during this period would warrant, as I said, a rethink of where we go. And while I know that that document would have looked at the SDGs and international trends, etc., at this point, I'm not sure where that is.
Where is that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I think we also have a question for Dr. James. Someone wants to know, in relation to the 10 pillars, what will hold, and this might be a bit difficult for you to answer, what will hold the MOE accountable to such pillars? They've asked, well, we suggested that Dr. James might like to proffer a response.
What might hold the MOE?
The MOE accountable to such pillars? It's a big question.
Well, the answer is simple. People, yes. we,
yes.
if we are the system, And you see, this is the thing. We need to recognize the power that we hold. We do not use our power. Even in our learning, many times students give their power up to the lecturers because they feel that the thing between their two ears isn't working and it shouldn't work, and they don't want to work it and bring forward the ideas that they have. But that is what will hold the MOE accountable. Because if we really focus on human development and we are serious about it, all the other things have to flow to ensure that we take charge of the people that we're responsible for in this country. I mean, it's a simple thing. Even if we look at the preparation, you know, for teachers, for leaders, when we prepare the leader. And there's a difference. We prepare leaders, but we prepare also the leader. The leader is the 360, seeing the whole big picture, right? But we have to have a different kind of preparation for other leaders. For example, those who will take up the 90-degree perspective, a head of department, a dean, or a student leader. So we you know, we have we, the people, have to make the thing happen. And in that way, we will force the authorities to be accountable. And when it has to do with the heart, people act. You see what's happening with the gender violence protests and so on.
Thank you. And I guess that's where the word radical comes in as well, you know, from another angle. And speaking about roles of stakeholders and we, this one is Professor Delisle. Somebody wants to know, what is the role of the UE in this radical change process?
Well, that's why we're having this, and so we're glad that so many people are here. Our role is to facilitate both the politicians as well as the ministry. So in fact, we're having a webinar based on something the Prime Minister would have said twice, that he wants a transformation. So we're here to provide the help. We're here to provide the support. We're not on any side. We're just here to provide the support. Where did I get that from? Or am I creating philosophy? No. What we do realize in countries, well, I'm sorry to call countries again, like Singapore. So the Prime Minister would say, well, teach less, learn more. And what they then do is they translate that into a working policy that is then, as Mr. Seecharan said, implemented within the system. So all of us are arms. And so what we're doing, we are providing the expertise and the help and the assistance to work with you. We don't have an opinion and we want to push our way. We want to work with you.
And I think you've answered another question, which is, what are the next steps after the symposium? What can help or hinder moving forward? And I think you're saying that stakeholder dialogue, you know, our input in whatever way we can will help, and it's not going to happen overnight. I probably end with a very difficult question. I don't know if you'll want to answer it, Professor Delisle, or any other person. And this question is, how do you see Tobago as a decentralized education district fitting into the whole system reform? Would you like to tackle that or not?
Anybody wants to answer? I'll be very, very brief.
Yes,
we have supported Tobago tremendously. In fact, in our Masters in Education Leadership, two of our tutors are from Tobago, and we've worked with Dr. Verlene Bob extensively. My consultancy work, and you as a former director, you know that you've worked closely with her. So we support Tobago in everything that they do. We wish we could provide more help. We wish that everything could be evidence-based. So that's what I could say, but I'm sure Freddie will have a comment because she has roots here.
Dr. James, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we have to be mindful that THA is an entity on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And we all talked about the need for partnering, the need for collaborating, and the need for thinking along the same lines and thinking together. So with that in mind, you can see how we can reach across to the other side of the and how the other side of the and can reach across to our side. And we can forge some approach to how we go forward. Because as we indicated at the beginning of this webinar, it's not a matter of telling. It's a matter of discourse and really practicing what we preach in terms of working with each other.
Mm-hmm. And it was great that we could include some aspect of the Tobago involvement in our discussion, because in fact we are indeed Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, time does not permit for more interaction. Audience, we thank you for your robust participation and for the interest that you've shown in this webinar. On your behalf, let me thank again Mr. Seecharan, Dr. Freddie James, Professor Jerome Delisle, Dr. Renelle Lee-Piggott for their presentations, and also Ms. Keisha Nichols for her role in the interview segment of this webinar. So good night, and may you all have a safe and peaceful Easter weekend.